In the historic city of Dar, located in the heart of Madhya Pradesh, sits a highly contested medieval stone complex known as the Bhojshala. Under Indian law, it is classified as a protected archaeological monument of national importance, but it is also an active site of worship. On Fridays, the complex serves as the Kamal Mala Mosque, hosting local Muslims for afternoon prayers. On Tuesdays, and during the festival of Vasant Panchami, it is claimed by Hindus as a temple to the goddess Saraswati. When those days overlap, the competing claims require heavy security to manage the tension. Historians call this kind of space an architectural palimpsest, a site where newer structures are built directly over the effaced remains of older ones. The modern legal and religious definitions of this space demand a single, rigid identity. The physical layers of the architecture tell a completely different story. To understand the actual history of this intellectual center, we have to look past the modern folklore and read the masonry and epigraphy of the stones themselves. The story begins with King Bhoja. Ruling between 1000 and 1055 CE, he was one of the most prominent monarchs of the Paramara Dynasty. Bhoja was a prolific patron of the arts and sciences. Historical tradition credits him with authoring foundational Sanskrit texts on architecture, grammar, and poetics, including the massive literary treatise, the Sringarara Prakasha. Look at the macro architecture of the site in Dar today, and you are looking primarily at a 14th century construction. This diagram outlines the 14th century Islamic additions, notably the domed tombs and dargah of Maulana Kamaluddin Chishti. However, this framework relies on spolia, repurposing older materials. The roof and archways are supported by 11th and 12th century columns. This construction method mirrors the Quwwat-ul-Islam Mosque in Delhi, which assembled its courtyards using the dismantled pillars of earlier regional temples. The physical footprint proves sequential occupation. The current building operates as a skeleton assembled from the bones of an earlier era. The details of that earlier era began to surface in 1903, when the Dar State Superintendent of Education, K.K. Lele, noticed inscriptions embedded directly into the mosque's walls and floors. This discovery shifted the focus of the site entirely toward epigraphy, the study and translation of ancient inscriptions. Lele and researchers documented massive literary fragments. They found early poetry like the Rauvel of Rhoda and the Kurmashataka, Prakrit verses praising the tortoise avatar of Vishnu. They also found a stone etched with a play called the Vijayashri Nataka. The text explicitly states that the play was performed in front of a king at a temple dedicated to Saraswati, the goddess of learning. But the most complex discovery was the Sarpabandha carvings. These stones feature a matrix of Sanskrit characters carved to follow the curves of a snake. When read along intersecting lines, the letters form specific rules for verb and noun conjugation. These grammatical matrices tie directly back to King Bhoja, who authored the famous linguistic treatise, the Saraswati Kantabharana. Because of these embedded educational texts, K.K. Lele concluded the site was originally King Bhoja's Royal College, officially dubbing the complex the Bhojshala. Yet mid-19th century British records from researchers who surveyed the Kamal Mala Mosque completely lack the term Bhojshala. The local population at the time had no living tradition of that name. The current Bhojshala identity emerged in the 20th century as a retroactive construction, built from studying displaced stones rather than an unbroken local tradition. This retroactive labeling quickly extended to the most famous artifact associated with the site, a stone sculpture currently housed in the British Museum in London. In 1924, historian O.C. Ganguly published an influential paper identifying this sculpture as King Bhoja's lost Hindu goddess of learning, Saraswati, also known as Vagdevi. To understand what the sculpture actually is, we have to introduce the concept of a yakshi. In Jainism, a yakshi is a benevolent nature spirit and attendant deity. We know this because of the 1091 CE Sanskrit inscription carved into the base of the statue. A careful translation reveals a sequence of events. First, the patron Vararuchi commissioned an image of Vagdevi. Second, he commissioned figures of 3 Jain spiritual teachers, known as Tirthankaras. Finally, the text states that Vararuchi commissioned this beautiful image of Ambika. Modern linguists have proven the inscription is dedicating the physical object it sits on as Ambika, a Jain yakshi. The text is merely referencing a previously built Vagdevi statue that is currently lost. Comparing the Dar statue to an 11th century Ambika from Sehor reveals its origin. Both feature a lion mount and nearly identical small bearded attendant figures. Rigorous translation and visual comparison correct the historical record. This object is not King Bhoj's Hindu Saraswati, but a masterpiece of Jain heritage. Look at the entirety of the evidence side by side: the Islamic architectural footprint, the Sanskrit grammatical matrices, and the Jain statuary. The historical texts explain how these seemingly disparate traditions coexisted. The 14th century writer Maritunga documented the intellectual culture of the region in his text, the Prabandha Chintamani. He recorded that Saraswati temples built during the Paramara era explicitly featured verses dedicated to Jain spiritual leaders, proving a deep cross-religious integration in these learning centers. That ancient fluidity stands in sharp contrast to the modern bureaucratic reality. The Archaeological Survey of India implements strict time-sharing rules, carving the week into separate, isolated hours for Hindu and Islamic worship. In May 2026, the Madhya Pradesh High Court issued a ruling that legally defined the Kamal Mala complex exclusively as a Vagdevi temple, granting worship rights solely to Hindus. This creates intense friction between rigid judicial definitions and the deeply layered multi-faith reality embedded in the archaeology. The legacy of King Bhoj's intellectual center remains legible in the physical stones, a complex, layered record that outlasts both colonial misidentifications and modern legal rulings.